Hello, welcome to Lecture 2 for Topic 5, and in this lecture we're going to be taking a look at gender gap in representation. What will we be looking at in this lecture? Well, first we're going to be doing a refresher on the United States Congress. Since we're going to be talking about diversity in Congress, it's important that we're all on the same page in terms of understanding how Congress is organized. And next, we're going to be looking at an examination of the gender gap in representation. In other words, is there a gap between the number of women that serve in Congress as related to the representation in the general population? So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the United States Congress is composed of two chambers. It is composed of the United States House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So the United States Congress is a bigger institution. It has more members, and the terms for the members of the House are different. Each member of the House has a 2-year term. There are 435 members of the United States Congress. Representation is based on population. So the larger your state is, the more representatives you get. So for example, Wisconsin has a relatively small population. So we get 8 members in the House of Representatives. The United States Senate is a smaller institution. Its members serve for a longer term. They have 6-year terms. Representation in the Senate is not based on population. Rather, it's just based on the fact that you are a state. So each state gets equal representation. Every state gets 2 senators. There are 50 states, and so there are 100 senators. So a state like California, which has the largest population in the United States, gets the same number of senators as does the smallest state, which is the state of Wyoming. So every 2 years we have a federal election. What does that mean? Well, for example, in 2018 we had a federal election, and it was known as the midterm election. A midterm election is where we're electing members of Congress, the Senate, and the House. This year, 2020, we have what's known as a presidential election. So we are electing members of Congress, but we are also electing the President of the United States. All members of the House are up for re-election every 2 years. Since their term is only 2 years long, they stand for re-election every 2 years. Since the term of the Senate is 6 years, only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. We divide the Senate up into thirds, and 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. Members can serve for as long as they want, or actually as long as their constituents, the people that they represent, want. We do not have any term limits in the United States Congress. Each session of Congress is numbered. We are currently in the 116th U.S. Congress. A Congress runs for 2 years. The current Congress started on January 3rd, 2017, and it runs until January 3rd, 2021. The next Congress will start on January 3rd, 2021. It'll be called the 117th U.S. Congress, and this will be following the November 3rd elections. We've been numbering our Congresses ever since the first Congress, which started in 1789. So what is the demographics of Congress? Is Congress representative of the United States? In other words, when we look at the general population of the United States, does Congress look like the United States in terms of gender, age, race, income, etc.? Does it matter whether Congress is representative of the United States? And if it does matter, should efforts be made to make Congress more diverse? Well, here's a graph that takes a look at comparing the population of the United States to the population in Congress. Now, to understand this graph, you have to look at that the large rainbow or arc on the outside of the diagram. So when you look at the gender, you see this large arc. that arc is representing the United States population. And then the arc that's in the middle of the diagram represents the representation in the House. And then the smallest arc, shows you the representation in the Senate. So if Congress looks like or is a representation of the larger population, all three of those arcs are going to look very similar. But if the outside arc looks really different than the two inner arcs, then that means that we don't have strong, that in other words, Congress doesn't really look like the general population of the United States. When you look at gender, the United States population is half men, half women, but clearly that's not the case in the House and the Senate. We see better representation when it comes to religion and when it comes to race. That when it comes to religion, we see that most people in the United States are Protestant, and the second highest group is Catholic. And we see a fairly close representation there in Senate and the House. When you look at party, there's a lot of kind of a gap in terms of representation. Many people in the United States don't affiliate with a party, yet to be a member of Congress, you either have to be affiliated with the Republicans or the Democrats. That's not a rule, but it's difficult to get elected if you run as an independent or a third party. Race is more representative than gender, although there is still definitely some improvements to be made to be more representative. The general population of the United States has more diversity in terms of African Americans, Hispanic, and Asians, but both the Senate and the House are less representative. So this graph shows you sort of general overview of representation in Congress. But let's dig in and look specifically at gender. Advances have been made in diversity, but we still have a long way to go. When it comes to gender diversity, if we want to reach parity in the United States Congress, if we continue with the trend in terms of the advancements we've been making in terms of women's representation in Congress, we won't get to 50-50 representation in Congress like we have in the general population for gender until 90 years from now, long after I'll be dead. And maybe if you guys have longevity in your veins, you might be alive, but still a long ways off. Looking at racial representation in Congress, 78% of Congress is white, while only 61% of the United States population is white. So we still see a gap there. And as we saw on the previous slide, 51% of the US population is women, but only 24% of the members of Congress are women. So it's there that we see really a very significant gap in terms of representation. This slide does a good job of showing the long-term trend in terms of representation in Congress, but also just how long it takes to make progress in terms of reducing the gap between representation of men and women in Congress. So you see for a very long period of time until about 1980s that we see that there is, pretty stagnant in terms of the number of women that are serving in Congress. But after 1980, for a variety of reasons that you'll be learning about in the readings for this week, we see a significant increase in the number of women represented in Congress, but still there's a huge gap between the number of men in Congress and the number of women in Congress. We also see growing racial and ethnic diversity in Congress as well, and the most recent Congress has some of the highest levels of racial diversity that we've seen in a while. And so that you can see over time that we're increasing our racial diversity, but as we saw in the previous slides, that Congress is still wider than the whole of the United States. So the question is do we need a more representative Congress? And the readings for the discussion this week examine that question and give you an opportunity to discuss amongst yourselves the answers to the question about do we need a more representative Congress? And so, in that discussion, we'll be looking at the impact of the lack of parity, in particular as it relates to gender. So, if you had a more gender diverse Congress, would it make a difference? And so, we'll look at what the researchers say about Congress, that the impact of not having a gender diverse Congress. And we'll also be exploring strategies for closing the gap. That if it matters that we need a more gender equal Congress, then how do we achieve that goal? And so you'll get an opportunity to debate the different strategies that are used for closing the gap. Okay, thanks for listening, and I look forward to reading your discussion.